year. Second year took about 10 hours. And then afterwards, it only takes about an hour of prep time. So for every hour I'm in front of you guys, it's still preparing for like an hour, like over the weekend to get stuff ready. So to prepare a new lecture for next Thursday on coronavirus and not make a fool of myself, I want to be up here and make a fool of myself, will take me a long time. That's why I'm debating whether to do it or not. I certainly can do a QA, and I will do a QA. If I don't do the lecture, I'll do a QA on coronavirus. That I can do quite easily. Does anyone have any questions about coronavirus right now before I move on to today's material? Now that I've wasted time. Does anyone know the difference between a quarantine and a cordon sanitaire? Quarantine is when you quarantine the people who are sick. That's not what they've done in China. Right now in China, 700 million people have been under house arrest since January the 25th. Okay? That's a cordon sanitaire. Both the sick and the non-sick are being isolated. All right? It's unbelievable what's been done in China right now. Now, it's not enforced by force of arms, but the totalitarian society in China is able to do that. There are block groups, there are people that make sure you don't violate whatever the government has said. And every 2 or 3 days in different districts or different cities, different prefectures, people have coupons that allow them to leave the house to go shop for stuff. So every 2 or 3 days, one person gets to leave and go. Many supplies useful in China are selling out in the United States right now because Chinese nationals in this country are buying up stuff and shipping it back to China. They're desperate back there. Does anyone, well anyway, I won't go through the whole thing. There's lots to talk about. The history of previous pandemics from 100 years ago. Has anyone taken any classes on the Spanish flu epidemic from 100 years ago? Has anyone heard of that? It's one of the worst pandemics of all time. You know, millions of people died around the world, and it had many political and economic effects. Anyway, so we may cover that. Any questions right now about coronavirus real quick and about the last time before I move on? Yes. Hold on. You moved seats, right? Don't you usually sit over there on the edge? No, you sit over there. Help remind me. Julius, that's right, Julius. Thank you, Julius.
What countries are made to low made to have this?
Well, the problem is the whole world. So a pandemic doesn't mean, pandemic means that, first of all, an epidemic, okay, so let's look. An endemic disease is a disease that's present in human populations all the time. An epidemic disease means there's a greater than standard prevalence of the disease. There's more of it than we typically see. And the second meaning of the word epidemic is that it's spreading from person to person. But you can have an epidemic without spread. For example, you can have an epidemic of lead exposure, but I'm not giving you lead exposure, meaning you, there's just more of it. So strictly an epidemic just means more of it than you typically expect. A pandemic means it's occurring in more than one place, for example, around the world. So AIDS, HIV was pandemic, for example, okay? So, it's going to spread everywhere. There's going to be no place that's spared in the planet eventually. There's a wide range of estimates as to how many people will get the disease, and this is too early to predict right now. And you don't want to be alarmist, right? You don't want to alarm people. But most countries will be struck. So the United States will have outbreaks. The only question is when and how big they'll be. The disease it has some interesting properties. It's more people die of the flu. In fact, more people die of everything we've been discussing in this class than have died or will die probably, hopefully, of coronavirus. But it's 30 times more deadly than the flu. So the flu, about 1 out of 1,000 people who get the flu die. As you know, influenza is one of the leading killers. We've been learning that in this class. Coronavirus is 30 times, we estimate, more deadly. And so it's all a function of how many people get infected. You know, if millions of Americans get infected, then tens of thousands will die. That's a lot, you know, and it'll have huge impact on our society. It's too early to tell if that's what's going to happen. I don't think so, but I can't predict. But I can tell you it's going to hit the United States. In Italy, I don't know if you saw, like 4 days ago, there was like a little mention of a Chinese business. I don't remember if he was ethnically Chinese or ethnically Italian, but he was a businessman that moved between Italy and China. He came back from China, he had some meals, whatever. He infected 47 people, which is really weird that one person infected 47 people. And like 2 days later, they had an outbreak. And then a day after that, the Italian authorities sealed 50,000 people in Italy. So we've had outbreaks in Iran, in Italy, In China, there's the Japanese plague ship, which is another whole history of plague ships. Has anyone ever heard about plague ships before? Very interesting, like history about that. And so there's an outbreak in China. There have been about 60 cases in the United States, but they're all imported cases. People we brought back quarantined. There have been no secondary cases yet. But there's no reason to imagine that the borders aren't porous. So it's going to happen. There'll be a case in New York, whatever. Who knows what Yale would do the first time there's a case at Yale? Anyone have thought about this? Yeah, what do you think Yale will do?
Maybe
What?
quarantine the patient.
Well, the patient will be quarantined. And there's also, when you guys come back from the spring break, you're going to come from all over the country, you're going to return, they're going to ask you to self-isolate if you show symptoms, and you should do that. You should also wash your hands twice a day. You should be doing the elbow bump for greetings. You can do it with a twist if you want, or without a twist, it's up to you. So the basic stuff you can do, but when there's a case, the typical recommendations are that all non-essential social activities stop. So we shouldn't interact with each other if there's a case. So it'll be interesting to see if there's an outbreak here on the Yale campus, how it's handled. Yes? What's her name again? Helen.
What are you doing about vaccine development and how
It'll take about 18 months. It's an RNA virus. It's harder to develop vaccines for RNA viruses. And I'm sure we'll have one eventually. I don't know how useful it'll be, and I don't know the timing. This is also very well discussed in the movie Contagion. Other than the fact that it's Gwyneth Paltrow, the rest is sort of reasonably realistic in the movie. Yes, Ben?
So why is it that influenza is a virus that's established and we get it every year? Is there a chance that the coronavirus could
People are, that's really a great question. People are predicting, I think it's crazy, I don't know if it's true or not. People are predicting that coronavirus will become the 5th endemic coronavirus in human species. So there's a big event that happens. From now on, there'll be coronavirus season. It won't be as deadly. As time goes by, the reason that bats are so interesting is and people don't understand this, people theorize that bat immune systems are more similar to ours. So germs that evolve to be transmissible in bats, then if and when they hop to humans, are killers in us. Because the germ has avoided the bat immune system. So there's something about, it's weird. Even in Contagion, it begins with a bat. In China, actually. So it's a very weird kind of thing, where you have exposure of the human, things that humans eat with wild animals, particularly bats. So what happens is, once it enters our human population, a couple things happen. First of all, susceptible people die. So our gene pool, we evolve in response to that. So the most susceptible among us will die of the disease. But second, our immune system fights it. So for example, your immune system fights the pathogen, and then you spread it to me. It's been weakened. The pathogen, when it leaves your body and comes to mine, it's already been weakened some. Plus, the pathogen doesn't, quote, want to be very deadly, because if it's too deadly, it kills us. Like Ebola, the reason we don't have pandemics of Ebola is that Ebola kills its subjects. A less lethal Ebola would be unbelievable. I mean, really frightening. I mean, Ebola's already terrifying, but if it were actually less lethal, hundreds of thousands of people would die. It's a horrible disease. So that's part of what happens. And this is in turn related to another little wrinkle. Did any of you have natural chicken pox when you were young? Okay, do you remember, were you the first or second in your family to get the disease? Raise your hands if you were the first in your family to get the, come on, raise your hands high. And raise your hands if you were the second in your family to get chicken pox. Okay, the people who were second get it worse. The reason they get it worse is that in the family you're genetically related. So the pathogen in you adapts to your immune system and then spreads to her, who's your sister. And then when it infects her, it's already partially adapted to that family's immune system. So it really strikes hard in the second person. That's different, that intrafamilial kinship transmission is different than the interpersonal, where my immune system has no resemblance to yours. Anyway, yes, Julius. Yes, so that is, like all the stuff in this class. It is not irrational to be wary of people returning from China, right? I mean, or if they were returning from Iran, or Italy, or any other part. But of course, if you're Chinese, you look Chinese, whereas the average Italian crossing looks like American, quote unquote. You know what I'm talking about. Please don't misunderstand me. So that it's very tempting in times of epidemics to otherize other groups of people. So I think the right public health recommendation is to focus on where are people transiting through. So if you're coming from China, the current CDC recommendations are that you self-quarantine or they take your temperature and they quarantine you. You can only arrive from China in 11 cities in this country right now. When you arrive, you are checked. If you have a fever, you have to be quarantined for 2 weeks. If you don't, you can be let through, and also we recommend self-quarantine. That's going to expand that list of countries, and eventually there will be so many that it will stop. So, on one hand, in other words, it's a prudent public health recommendation to identify countries of origin and have extra precautions. On the other hand, we don't want to racialize this because then that becomes a problem in and of itself. Did I answer your question? No, tell me. What would you like to know? I can't hear you speak up.
Sorry. Like, for example, I had someone say paper comment yesterday to me about, insinuating that all Asians have corona, and I was actually going to defend them. So what information might you use?
I see. No, all Asians do not have coronavirus. No, that's not true. Even in China, which has 1.3 billion people, the number of cases in China, I think, is like 80,000. So it's infinitesimally small compared to the population. So no, that's just false. That's not correct. So, what else do you need to know to tell them that's not true? No. This happens all the time, right? I mean, with the AIDS epidemic, the stigmatization of gays and Asians, it's like, Haiti had a hell of a time after this happened. So this is very standard. Incidentally, sometimes it's exploited for political ends. So there's a long history of referring to foreigners as being like rats and having diseases. And it doesn't matter what part of the world you're from, people do this in all parts of the world about all other groups. And so that's why it was, I have to say I am extremely depressed by the jargon of the current president of the United States when he refers to people from other parts of the world as rats. This has an old history, the use of that term, and the evocation of, these are vermin that need to be exterminated kind of idea. This is seen across history, across time. All right. Okay, so we'll talk maybe next Thursday. We'll devote a whole lecture to this. I'll see, I've already spent 10 minutes on this. So last time we discussed different ways of conceiving of the causes of death, with a particular emphasis on health behaviors and on smoking, alcohol, and gun deaths. We continue to look at the impact of various public health interventions, ranging from taxes to laws to counter-marketing. And today I'm going to be speaking about income inequality. And one of the interesting things about income inequality, people, is that income inequality is intrinsically a collective property of groups. You can speak of the wealth of a group or the wealth of an individual, but you can only speak of the inequality of a group. You cannot speak about the inequality of an individual, right? It is an intrinsic collective property of a group. And this may be contrasted, therefore, with strictly individual measures like education, income, or race that we've discussed in the past. And so I want to provide a sort of pivot for a conversation we'll be having about the importance of social support, social networks, and social capital by setting the stage using some of the ideas when we discuss inequality. And I want to examine how yet another social structural factor influences the health of individuals. Now, this is a pretty standard way to chart wealth, variation in wealth around the world, and you can easily see the rich and the poor countries, which are most of the ones you would expect. So many of you have probably seen maps like this before. This is a map of the planet. It shows per capita GDP. You have Europe and North America and Australia are rich, and then a bunch of middle-income countries and some poor countries. It's pretty typical. You're quite familiar with it. And not surprisingly, the wealthier the country is, the healthier it is. So this is at the country level, a couple of hundred countries. This is GDP per person, adjusted for purchasing power parity, so over here. And here's average life expectancy in years. And unsurprisingly, as the countries get richer, they get healthier. Okay? So people living in richer countries are also, the countries that have richer people are also countries that have healthier people. All right? And, but you see that the curve is curvilinear. It flattens out. So the richer and richer you get, the lower returns you have. Okay? So down here, as you get go from 5,000 to 10,000, your life expectancy goes from 50 to 70 in the country. But here, when you go from 20,000 to 25,000, it doesn't change much. From 76 to 77 or whatever it is. So there's lower marginal, but still increasing return to per capita income at higher incomes. But there's another way to look at wealth. One that privileges not how wealthy each country is per capita, but how that wealth is distributed within the country, within each country. And it turns out that both the absolute level of wealth and the distribution of wealth might be relevant to health outcomes within a country at various levels of geography, as we're going to be seeing. So how might one measure inequality in the distribution of wealth? What would be a completely unequal distribution? If you had to pick a grossly unequal distribution of wealth, what would that be? Let's say of the people in this room. What would the most unequal distribution you could imagine be? Yeah, Selena. Yeah, that would be completely unequal. One person has all the wealth, I have all the money, and the rest of you have none. And what would be a completely equal distribution of wealth? Yeah,
we all have the same amount of wealth.
Yeah, everyone has the same, okay? So between those two extremes, there could be any number of alternative possibilities. Now here, just to be clear, we're talking about outcome, not opportunity or deservedness. We're just describing, quantifying how equally is the wealth distributed. It's a numerical description, not a moral assessment. Now here's one way that inequality can be quantified. This is something known as the Gini coefficient. And we're going to set two numbers. 0 corresponds with perfect equality, where everyone has the same income. And 1 corresponds with perfect inequality, where one person has all the income and everyone else has 0 income. And here's what we're going to do if we want to quantify the inequality in this society, in this group. We're going to measure my wealth, we're going to measure your wealth, and we're going to take the difference between the two. And then we're going to measure my wealth and measure your wealth, and take the difference between the two. And with you. And with every single person, you're going to look at how my wealth differs from every other person's. You're going to sum that and average it. Okay? So you look at the average absolute difference of my wealth with everyone else's wealth in this room. You with me so far? Then you do that with Ben. And you do computation with everyone else. And then with Selena, and then with Julius, and then with Jalen, and so forth. And you keep walking down the list, so then you average the averages. Do you understand? You average the average difference of the average difference between each person and everyone else. So algebraically, it's half the arithmetic average of the sum of the absolute differences between all pairs of incomes in a population normalized to the mean income. So right here is the heart of the matter. Over individual I minus individual j, you take the absolute difference, mine versus Ben, mine versus Selena's, mine versus Stephen's, and so forth and so on. And then you compute the average of that difference. You sum from n to j, from j is 1 to n, and then in here you normalize it. There's a the number of people. There are actually 2 normalizations, and then you repeat that computation for all individuals, and then that's the Gini coefficient. Okay. Now, typically this is used to measure income inequality, but it can be used to measure distribution on any axis. For example, inequality in height, or inequality in age, or inequality in education. Right? You could, anything that varies across populations, you could see how much variation is there, how different are the people from each other in the group. And another way to describe income distribution is something known as a Lorenz curve. So in a Lorenz curve, for example, let's say you're computing the wealth of households. So here you have the deciles of households. Here's the 10% poorest households, 20% poorest, 30% 40, up to all of the households. And here is the proportion of total income. So in the line of equality, 10% of the households would have 10% of the income, the bottom 20% of the households would have the bottom 20% of the income, the bottom 30% of the households would have the bottom 30% of the income, and so forth. If income were equally distributed, as you keep adding more and more households, deciles of households, you would get a uniform addition of wealth. Okay? If income is not equally distributed, you get this curve, the Lorenz curve, which says, for example, that the bottom 10% of households have 1% of the wealth. And the bottom 20% of the households have 5% of the wealth, or whatever it is. You understand? And then you can draw this curve as a result. It turns out that there's a very deep relationship between the Gini coefficient that I just taught you and this curve, the Lorenz curve, which is that the ratio of the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorentz curve, which is A, and the area underneath the Lorentz curve, B, if you go A over A plus B, so A over all this, so A right there, that's the Gini index, okay? So there's a relationship between those two quantities. And a perfectly equal income distribution would be one in which every person has the same income, and in this case, the bottom n% of society would always have the bottom n% of the income. And every point on the Lorentz curve represents a statement like the bottom 20% of all households have 10% of the income, or whatever. Now, there are other measures of inequality. There's something called the Robin Hood Index, and this approximates the share of total income that has to be transferred from households above the mean to those below the mean to achieve equality in distribution. So how much money do we have to take from the rich and give to the poor in order to equalize the income distribution? And actually, this index is equivalent to the maximum vertical distance between the Lorentz curve and the line of equality. So if you look at the maximum vertical distance and you get to this point, aha, that's the maximum vertical distance. That's the measure of the Robin Hood Index. So it tells you how separated the curves are at the maximum point of separation. And there are other measures as well, like the proportions of total income earned by the bottom 50% or whatever. Or, frankly, the statistic that there are 2,153 billionaires in the world, and they have more wealth than 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the population. So the top 2,000 richest people in the world have more money than 60% of the planet. It's just unbelievable. If any of you know a billionaire, that person is in like a very elite club in our world today. And income inequality in the United States, as measured by the Gini, has varied across time. And we are approaching by some measures, and have surpassed by some measures, a level of inequality that rivals the Gilded Age. So if you look back at the last 100 years and you look at the Gini coefficient, this is what happened at the time of the last crash in our society. Okay? Gini had gotten to astronomical levels, extremely high levels of inequality. And it declined in the 1960s and has gradually increased, especially during the first sort of Reagan-Bush administration. The inequality in our society has increased, and here's where it is now. So it's continued to increase, okay? So we're almost at the level we were 100 years ago in terms of how much inequality we were. And if any of you have taken history or studied the Gilded Age, you're familiar with some of the social stresses that were prevalent at that time. In fact, even among wealthy countries, there's variation in how wealth is distributed. The wealthy are not the same in every place. Here are some findings of a survey of population's ideal ratio between CEO and unskilled worker remuneration, and also estimation of their reality by country. So this slide shows, okay, if you ask citizens, what is your estimate of how much CEOs get? This is the estimated amount. Like, I think the CEOs get, whatever amount of dollars that is, like some large amount of dollars. Australians think CEOs get a huge amount of dollars, but this is what I think they should get right there. Whereas in Taiwan, there's more of a gap, more of a fit between what people in Taiwan think the CEOs are getting, which is the red tip there, and what they think they should be getting, which is the blue tip. In the United States, we think the CEOs shouldn't be getting very much. They're right here. And we think they're getting that much, okay? This is the gap between what Americans think is ideal and what we think the CEOs are actually getting. But actually the situation is much worse than that, because this entire curve fits in this curve, which is what the CEOs actually are getting, okay? So if you look at the United States here, people, we were way down in there. We thought the CEOs should get this much. We thought they weren't getting this much, but actually they're getting this much. Okay? A huge difference. Okay? And the United States is off the charts in this mismatch compared to other countries. So, for example, a typical American CEO, if you compare what he's getting paid or she's getting paid compared to a typical line worker, it's about 500 times the compensation. Compared to, let's say, Japan, it's about 20 times. Okay? Those are rough numbers. Those aren't exactly right because there's a lot of pay, but you get the picture in terms of what's going on. And here's a closer look at the ratio of CEO pay to average wages across a sample of countries. The USA has a ratio of about, as I said, 500 to 1, exceeding all other countries. So this is the ratio of average CEO pay to average wages in the Netherlands, you know, it's not so different. Switzerland, I'm sorry, this is 2007 versus 2011. So the Netherlands are more egalitarian. The average CEO makes, let's say, 80 times what the average line worker makes, whereas in the United States it's about 500 times, at both in 2007 and in 2011. And in the last few decades, most real income growth has gone to the wealthiest. So one of the arguments about rising inequality is, well, maybe rising inequality is the price we have to pay for all getting richer. And there's legitimacy to that argument. It's actually, this is not, like I'm setting it up right now, so as usual for me, to think, oh, this is awful, inequality is awful. It's not always awful, is the truth. These topics are hard. But usually the argument is, well, we are getting more equal, but we're all getting richer, isn't that great? But unfortunately, that's not exactly true in our society. So if you look back to 1967, if you look at real income growth for the median American, they've gone from $43,000 to $51,000. A tiny improvement in the predicament of the median American in terms of how rich they truly are. Okay? And at the bottom, it's even smaller. But at the top, there's been a substantial, almost doubling in wealth. Okay? So most of the return, most of the wealth produced in our society in this time interval has been transferred to the top 10% or the top 1%. And the median American isn't seeing that much, okay? So that's politically a very difficult thing to sustain. And it may also have health implications, as we're going to be discussing today and in coming lectures. And indeed, inequality varies not just across time in the United States, but also across space. This graph shows the relationship between the Gini and mortality adjusted for age in each state in 1990. The circles have a diameter proportional to their population. So this shows the Gini of income per equivalent adult. So this is like the Gini coefficient. It varies from 0.34 to 0.48. And this shows the log odds of mortality, like how likely are you to die. And here are Mississippi and Louisiana that have the highest inequality and also the highest death rates, even adjusted for age. But here is Utah and New Hampshire that have the lowest inequality, and they're down lower on the end of the spectrum. But the question that arises is the following. Is everyone in unequal areas being harmed, or just those at the bottom? Would rich people in Mississippi or Louisiana, should they care about this inequality? Or maybe it's just the poor people in their states that are suffering, not them. And the general answer is, and this is interesting, that unequal income and hierarchy may not be bad just for those on the bottom. It actually may be bad for the health of everyone. And this is a very contested hypothesis, and it appears very sensitive to the level of geography that we're speaking about. We'll come to this. And note that even though that Louisiana and Mississippi, for instance, have high inequality and do worse than New Hampshire and Utah, something that's not shown on this slide, which is relevant, is they're also poorer. So maybe the reason that you're seeing this relationship here is just that they're poor, not that there's more inequality. So we have to account for the fact that Mississippi and Louisiana are poorer than New Hampshire and Utah before we make a strong statement that the inequality is what's driving the lack of good health. Do you understand? Maybe it's that they're poor that's making them sick, not that they're unequal that's making them sick in those states. And there's a similar relationship between income inequality and mortality across United States metropolitan areas. Metropolitan statistical areas, MSAs. And this is at a smaller level of geographic aggregation. So if you look now at hundreds of MSAs, you basically find the same pattern. It's not just at the state level. Well, what do we mean by a possible effect of an area in which a person resides? This is something we're going to be considering for several lectures. And the key idea here is the difference between compositional and contextual effects of local areas. So one idea is that area context matters. This is the difference that places make to people. A different idea is that area composition matters. This is the difference that people make to places. So if we find that people here have higher mortality rates, is there something deadly about this area? Like there's a toxic waste dump that's killing everyone. That's a difference that places make to people. Or is it that the people in this area are just elderly? And that's why this area looks like it's so unhealthy. That's the difference people make to places, okay? These are known as the contextual effect and the compositional effect of neighborhoods. And income inequality is an intrinsically contextual effect, yes, but maybe people who live in more unequal areas are different. For example, maybe they are poorer, the people who live in more unequal areas. Maybe the people in Louisiana and Mississippi are poorer than the people who live in more unequal areas, and that's what's causing the problem. Maybe it's a compositional effect, not a contextual effect. Maybe it's not something about Mississippi that's killing its residents. Maybe it's the people who live in Mississippi are poor, and that's, let's say, why they are dying. So, does living in a more unequal circumstance affect the health of individuals? Initial work in this area was purely ecological, like the work I've been showing you, which just looks at, okay, this area is sick and is poor, or this area is sick and it's unequal, okay? But eventually, more recent studies had superior designs involving both individual and contextual measures. So, for example, they were able to nest individuals within areas and measure individual income in addition to looking at collective properties. These are some results from a particularly well-conducted study from your reading, assessing how state-level inequality, net of individual income and other factors, can harm people. And this is a study that looked at people that were residing in the continental United States. So they had over 500,000 people, aged 18 to 74, during this time period. They were followed for an average of 4 years, and during that time there were near 20,000 deaths. And they had individual level family income in 27 categories, adjusted for inflation and family size, and state level Gini. So they said, after taking into account how rich or poor are you, does something about the inequality of the income in the state around you affect whether you die? After we take into account your age, your sex, your wealth, your education, and everything else. And the covariates include age, race, sex, marital status, state level poverty, and median income of the states. And here's what they found. They found, this shows the results from that study taken from your readings. First of all, they found what you would expect, which is there was a grading by wealth. Richer people, this was their mortality, the richest category. And as they got poorer, the risk of death increases substantially. So poor people were 2.69 times as likely to die as rich people, defined this way in this study. Okay? This is a finding you're familiar with by now. But now if you look at the top, let's see what is the relationship of state-level Gini. The most equal Ginis, those closest to 0, 0.324, are here. And as you get more and more unequal, as the state in which you live gets more unequal, your risk of death goes up. Not as much as if you were poor, but it still goes up. So that living in a more unequal state, your risk of death goes up by about 12% in this study. And in fact, the findings suggest a number of further observations. This is taken from your readings as well. One of the best studies in this regard. This looks at income inequality and individual mortality by personal income categories. So are you poor, are you near poor, are you middle income, or are you high income? And it looks at the death rate per 100,000 people by the state level income inequality. And what it finds, for example, is among the near poor, as the state becomes more unequal, your risk of death goes up. You see a grading here? Each step among the near poor, among the middle income, you see the same kind of hint. Among middle income people, as the state in which you live is more unequal, your risk of death goes up. But among the very poor, it's flat. And among the very rich, it's flat. You see that? Why might that be? Why might, for example, the very poor not be sensitive to income inequality in the state they live? Yes, Jewel.
So like they're giving that being poor and living in poverty has a greater effect on your health than the inequality of wealth. So like you can't really see the effects of inequality of wealth because being poor is
Yeah, you're already so, exactly. You're so downtrodden, there's nothing more we can do to you. You're in poverty, okay? It really doesn't matter. You know, you're going to die anyway, let's say. It doesn't matter if there's more pollution in the environment or income inequality or something out there, maybe. And at the upper end, at the rich, why aren't the rich sensitive to this? This is the richest here, yeah? Any ideas? Okay. Maggie Kemp. Who read this article? Raise your hand if you read the article. All right, turn around again. About how many people read the article?
20?
20%?
No, 20.
20, okay. read the reading, damn it, okay? So just do the reading. If you're not going to do well in the course, you don't do the reading. I picked the readings, there are not too many of them. Just do the reading. It's in the reading. Actually, I'm not going to tell you more. You're going to have to go do the reading to figure it out. Anyway, we'll return to the point. You'll see the point. And here's some results from another investigation, totally different investigation. These show that within every level of individual income, including among the richest, so here it's also true in the richest, living in a United States state with more inequality is associated with worse health, here maternal depression. So now we look at state income inequality, individual income, and maternal depression. And now we look at quintiles, and in every one of these you see an upward sloping, just like I discussed before, including at the top, most people, for the outcome here of maternal depression, as distinct from the previous study. But as I noted earlier, the results about the effects of income inequality are sometimes, mixed. It's complicated. It's not always exactly like you think. These are data from still another investigation of nearly 10,000 people nested within 60 metropolitan areas in the United States, and the investigators obtained self-reports of various chronic medical conditions, and they looked at how local income inequality, net of individual income, and other traits was associated with these health conditions. And to make a long story short, they found very little evidence of this effect. So there was sort of flat sloping for all of these conditions. So for example, lung disease, you didn't have more lung disease when it was higher inequality, or gynecologic problems, or heart disease. Roughly speaking, it didn't seem to matter in this study. And the Subramanian and Kawachi reading from your readings suggest that this is still an open question, but that there are nevertheless some interesting generalizations we can make about this huge literature. There are more findings in the United States than abroad, showing an effect of income inequality, and more findings at the state level than at other levels, like at city levels, which gives a hint about the possible mechanism having to do with state level policies. And this is one of the best studies to date, and I don't remember if I signed this reading. Did I sign this one? I don't think so. This is the Chetty reading. This is one of the best studies to date of this topic. This uses income data for the US population from 1.4 billion tax records between 1999 and 2014, and complete mortality follow-up for individuals that were between the ages of 40 and 76. And the figure shows population-weighted univariate correlations between local area characteristics and race and ethnicity-adjusted expected age of death for 40-year-olds in the bottom and top income quartile. So this shows, this is a list of attributes. So at the area level, so what's the, how many smokers are there in the area? What percent of people are uninsured in the area? What's the Gini index in the area? And what are local government expenditures in the area? And we're going to check, are those correlated with the mortality, the life expectancy of people conditional that they're reached 40, going forward, how long people live after the age of 40, is it associated with each of those area measures in these states? And I'm going to look at just 3. And we're going to look at people in the bottom income quartile and people in the top. So we'll look at the poorest people and the richest people. And we find that the poorest people and the richest people, if they live in areas with lots of smokers, there's a negative relationship between the number of smokers and their longevity. Okay? Everyone understand this is in the expected direction. If you live in an area with more smokers, whether you're rich or you're poor, you live in an area with more people who have shorter lifespans. Okay? But now let's look at the Gini. When we look at the Gini coefficient, we find in this study that it does not affect the poor. That actually local area Gini coefficient is not associated with increase, uncorrelated with mortality. This is zero correlation here, and these are the confidence intervals. But it is with the rich. Okay? So here, the rich suffer if they live in an area with high inequality. Their health is worse. You understand? And finally, if you look at local government expenditures, it matters for the poor. There's a positive correlation. The more money the local government is spending, the better the longevity of the poor, but it does not affect the rich. Okay? The rich don't need money spent on them to live a long time. The poor do need money spent on them. You understand? I just picked 3. There are many other things in this study, if you're interested in it, that you can look at. So income inequality is more negatively correlated with life expectancy for individuals in the highest income quartile, contrary to the idea that inequality has the most adverse effects on health of low-income individuals. So the scientists get better and better. They're zeroing in with better and better data to understand who might suffer and what is the mechanism. And the estimated health burden of inequality in the United States is actually quite high. The Conduit-all reading, from your readings, provides a meta-analysis of the effects of local inequality, documenting the likely impact. Like, how bad is it for our society? Like all the other stuff we've been talking about from a public health point of view, is inequality bad for our health, and how bad is it for our health? This slide shows the relative risk for subsequent mortality for 30 rich countries, an estimated number of deaths avoided if we were to level the Gini to 0.3. So can we estimate what would happen if we redistributed wealth in our society downward so that we got a Gini of 0.3, and here's the United States. We estimate that there are almost 1 million excess deaths because of our Gini in this study that was at that point 0.357. Okay? So this is an estimate of how bad, in terms of mortality, is inequality. Well, how? What's the mechanism? How might social inequality affect individuals? Well, the first possibility, there are 3 classes of explanations, and these are very important to understand this. There are 3 classes of explanations linking income inequality to individual health. First are the explanations that are known as the neo-material environment explanations. And this has to do with the environment around the people. Is there differential social spending? We just saw an example of that. Neglect of a common environment. For example, are areas in which there is greater inequality areas that don't invest in clean air? So when there's a lot of income inequality, maybe in those countries or those places, people say, we're not going to prevent pollution. But when there's more equality, we are going to work together to prevent pollution. Is there underinvestment in human capital in areas where there's high inequality? Or is there lower social capital? A very deep and important idea that we'll return to in a couple of lectures. So these are known as the neo-material in that they reflect the modern environment that we humans live in and construct. For example, egalitarian societies may make more investments in the common good. There may be more investments in infrastructure used in common and shared by all, like trauma centers, for example, or techniques for reducing pollution. Maybe if we live in a more egalitarian society, we say, let's do more trauma research. Anyone could be shot. Anyone could be in a car accident. Let's make investments in that. Or let's clean the air, clean the water. Whereas if we're in a more unequal society, the rich might say, you know what? I'm going to buy a water purifier for my own house. And I'm going to have an operating room and a surgeon on staff in my own house. And I don't care what happens to anyone else, for example. And similarly, in more equal areas, there might be greater investments in public goods, such as food safety, public education, or library books, or even maternal health that benefits everyone, rich and poor alike. A more egalitarian society might have less crime, and so fewer rich people might be shot in a more egalitarian society. And there could even be a development of social capital, which is an idea I'll come back to. Or, as Lynch et al. Argue, income inequality might be associated with educational and medical expenditures per capita, or investments in vaccination. And these types of things might in turn have cumulative effects that affect people over their lifespan, and spillover effects as well. So that's the first set of ideas, and we'll talk more about this. Now the second set of arguments, which is the main thing we're going to discuss for the rest of the class today, focuses on psychosocial and environmental processes, of which there might be 2 types. This is something about being in an unequal environment harms your body, okay? Because you feel bad. There could be direct physiologic effects, like it's more stressful to be in an unequal society, or direct psychological effects, like you might have relative deprivation. You might not like it. Many people might not like being in a more unequal society. So income inequality, and so we'll return to, actually we're going to consider the psychosocial processes today, and we're going to return to the physiologic effects via stress next time. So for the rest of the class today, we're really just going to focus on this hypothesis here, the direct psychological effects under the psychosocial environment explanation, and we'll return to some of these others in the coming lectures. So inequality could work via psychosocial means, and it could damage health by a sense of relative deprivation, an erosion of social bonds, or latent social conflict or hostility or resentment that harms everyone. In other words, if you look at these categories, income inequality might produce adverse effects inside people's bodies and not just outside their bodies. Okay? So the neo-material explanations are things that happen outside your body. The psychosocial explanations are things that inequality does inside your body. Okay? So there are two different kinds of things that inequality might do. Moreover, these mechanisms may reinforce each other, of course, and may operate on different levels of geographic aggregation, larger and smaller, respectively. So the neo-material explanations may operate at high levels, like states, and the psychosocial levels may operate at low levels, like schools. Moreover, income inequality over smaller areas might have either more or less of an effect than inequality over larger area, less since investments occur at the state level, or more since we assess ourselves over a smaller range. When you think about how rich you are, you look at the people around you. You don't think abstractly about the whole state or the whole nation. And the third explanation, which I'll say a little bit about at the end of the lecture today, is a technical thing known as the individual income explanation, and I'll come back to that. So let's consider the first one, the first psychosocial explanation here first. So do you know that feeling you get when you walk past first class to get to your economy seat? Raise your hands if you've had that experience. You board the plane, you go through, like, you'll see these people here, and then you get to your seats over here, okay? It's really, I mean, look at them up here in the front. It's really annoying, okay? And it's depressing, and it makes you feel envious. You know, maybe it passes. You get to the back of the plane, and you sit down, and you open your book, and you stop thinking about the people in first class. Now the question is, what is it about this difference that's harmful to you? Is this psychosocial aspect the feature that harms you during your flight? Is that why you feel less rested and more stressed when you arrive than the fortunate first-class travelers? Why are you worse off? Is it the fact that while you were in the back, you were stewing about the existence of these people up in the front of the plane, and it made you miserable, and then when you arrived, you know, you were in a horrible state? Or is it the material conditions? They have more room, get more sleep, have less noise, they have fresher air. I don't know if you know that, because the air enters the plane from the front, and so the first class people get to breathe all the freshest air, and then it moves to the back of the plane, okay? Or better food. And this distinction is very important between the new material and psychosocial explanations because it has relevance for policy. Under a psychosocial interpretation, these health inequalities would be reduced by abolishing first class. Or perhaps by offering therapy to those that don't get first class to make them feel better. Right? So if the problem is psychosocial, we're like, well, we're going to do away with first class. Or we're going to give these guys some drugs or therapy to make them feel better about this inequality. But from a neo-material viewpoint, we would need to upgrade the conditions in economy class. Right? We would need to do something to make economy class better. Fresher air and better food, if that was the policy. And both sorts of effects could obtain, of course, but they might have different magnitudes in terms of effectiveness. Now this example, which I've been teaching this example for many years, turns out over the last few years, people increasingly have been thinking about this example. Because you can actually use the Gini measure to quantify the inequality in seat space and plot how it has changed across time. So this is a typical plane, you know, these are typical planes across time, and you can quantify how unequal is the space distributed in these various kinds of planes. So this is a relatively equal distribution of space, a Gini of 0.08. This is an unequal distribution. This is an even more unequal distribution of the space in the airplane. Roughly speaking, in old planes, this is just like the money example we talked about earlier. In old planes, 7% of the passengers used about 15% of the room, with the other 93% using 85% of the cabin space. And such a plane would have a Gini coefficient of 0.08. And for reference, the United States Gini right now is about 0.48. But things have actually become a lot more unequal. In today's standard US domestic configuration, the 12% of people in first class use about 25% of the passenger space. The 51 people in economy plus use another 30%. And that leaves the sardines, the other 157 people, with 45% of the space. And this gives us a Gini index of about 0.16. And transatlantic flights that many people are increasingly taking are actually taking this even to the next level. And this is on the bottom what it looks like with a transatlantic flight with a Gini of 0.25. The 21% of people in the front use 40% of the plane. By the way, this gives you a nice way to appreciate how unequal our society has become. It's more unequal even than the allocation of space on planes. Okay? So our Gini, if you measure the Gini in our society, it's almost 0.5. So it's much more unequal even than this. Now, of course, this is complicated because the people pay money for different space and amenities on the plane, and because actually economy class may be really terrific compared to taking the bus or walking. Okay, so it's not the case that, like, if you want to take this sort of toy example and give you all the way to the limit, critics would say, well, really, Nicholas, the comparison here should be to the alternative of these people have to hitchhike or walk the distance. Isn't it miraculous that they can spend $300 and sit like a sardine and fly across the country? So really, it's not unfair at all. Still, the modern airplane reflects a social microcosm of a class-based society, making inequality salient to passengers through both the physical design of the plane, the presence of a first-class cabin, and more subtly, the boarding procedure, whether economy passengers must pass through the first-class cabin, as I mentioned before. One study hypothesized that both types of inequality on airplanes, the physical inequality, the presence of first class, and the situational inequality, the boarding location, could trigger antisocial behavior like air rage. This study examined the base rate of air rage, the number of incidents per 1,000 flights. And it found that air rage is relatively more common in economy class on flights with first class. So it looks at, economy class incidents, and it looks at whether the flight is delayed, and unsurprisingly, if the flight is delayed, the more delay there is, the more air rage episodes there are. Okay, that makes sense. But what about, is there a first class present? If there's a first class present, air rage incidents occur at like almost 4 times the rate as when there's no first class present, even after controlling for all this stuff. But it matters whether you board from the front or not. If you board from the front, it increases air rage in economy class. Okay? You have to walk through that first class, then you're sitting in the back there, and then you're more likely to strike out at your colleagues than if you don't board, even after controlling for all of these other features. In fact, the presence of first class is associated with a greater odds of air rage, equivalent to an approximately 10-hour flight delay. So you're like, just the fact that there's a first class in there corresponds to, you know, how miserable you would be if you had to wait 10 extra hours in the plane. And in fact, boarding from the front increases the odds, as I said, by 2.1 times. That's equivalent to a 6-hour flight delay. So the fact that you board through the front of the plane makes you as miserable as if you would, you know, measured here by your propensity to air rage, as if you had a 6-hour delay. So inequality, at least in this study, can be bad for your mental health. Now remember, I talked a moment ago about like, the neo-material versus psychosocial and what you might do in these types of situations. Lest you think that abolishing first class is a crazy idea, take a look at this event from a few years ago. This is a real event that occurred in Sweden. Lunch ladies slammed for food that is too good. And I'll read it to you. It says, a talented head cook at a school in central Sweden has been told to stop baking fresh bread and to cut back on her wide-ranging veggie buffets because it was unfair to the students at other schools who didn't have access to the unusually tasty offerings. Now I'll keep reading to you. Annika Eriksson, a lunch lady at school in Falun, was told that her cooking is just too good. Pupils at the school have become accustomed to feasting on newly baked bread and an assortment of 15 vegetables at lunchtime. But now the good times are over. The municipality has ordered Eriksson to bring it down a notch, since other schools do not receive the same caliber of food, and that is unfair. From now on, the school's vegetable buffet will be halved in size, and Eriksson's handmade loaves will be replaced with store-bought bread. Her traditional Easter and Christmas smorgasbords may also be under threat. Parents and pupils alike find the municipality's orders distasteful. Fourth graders at the school have even launched a petition in protest against the decision to put a lid on Eriksson's passion for cooking. What do you guys think about this? Is this a good thing to do or not? I want every one of you to take a stand. It's not hard. It's a lunch lady in Sweden case. What do you think? Raise your hands if she should be stopped from doing this. One person. No. Raise your hands if she should not be stopped from doing this. A few of you didn't offer opinions, like you right there in the middle, but I'm going to let you pass on this occasion. Okay? So most of you think that this is nuts. Why should we stop this woman from doing this thing? It doesn't seem reasonable. This is the abolishing first class idea. You've all basically said, no, we're not going to abolish first class. And probably if I give you more time, you would say, what we really need to do is clone this woman and have her, all the other lunch ladies should be like her and deliver good food to all the other students, right? I mean, that would be a reasonable thing to do. Or keep it a secret. Don't tell the other people in the other schools what's happening. That will not make them so miserable, in fact. In fact, this case of canceling her was eventually reversed, just like you guys voted. They said, no, we're not going to do that. So Ms. Erickson eventually returned to taking good care of the students in the school. Well, this is an example I'm sure you will struggle with. Lest we laugh at the Swedes, sometimes we attempt crudely similar things here in the United States. Consider the allocation of slots in competitive schools in New York City. Here's what this story reads, and this is an active issue right now. In 2004, so it says, to make elite schools fair, city will punish poor Asians. And here's the reading. In 2004, raise your hands if you're familiar with the whole controversy about Stuyvesant. It's a wide, it's discussed now in our society. In 2004, seven-year-old Tin Shi arrived in New York from China, speaking almost no English. For 2 years, he shared a bedroom in Chinatown apartment with his grandparents, a cook and a factory worker, and a young cousin, while his parents put in 12-hour days at a small laundromat they had purchased on the Upper East Side. Tin mastered English and eventually set his sights on getting into Stuyvesant High School, the crown jewel of New York City's 8 specialized high schools. When he was in 6th grade, he took the subway downtown from his parents' small apartment to the bustling high school to pick up prep books for its 8th grade entrance exam. He prepared for the test over the next 2 years, working through the prep books and taking classes at one of the city's free tutoring programs. His acceptance into Stuyvesant prompted a day of celebration at the laundromat, an immigrant's family dream beginning to come true. Tin, now a 17-year-old senior starting at NYU in the fall, says of his parents, who never went to college, they came here for the next generation. Well, New York's storied specialized high schools have, for more than 70 years, admitted students based upon a competitive examination of math, verbal, and logical reasoning skills. But now, troubled by the declining Black and Hispanic enrollment at the schools, opponents of the exam have resurfaced. This comes up every few years. For example, Mayor Bill de Blasio has argued that relying solely on the test creates a rich get richer dynamic that benefits the wealthy who can afford expensive test preparation. Note, however, that there's free test preparation. But, and this is now the article, but as Tin's story illustrates, it may be affluent whites, rather than the city's burgeoning population of Asian American immigrants, a group that remains disproportionately poor and working class, whose children have aced the exams in overwhelming numbers. And ironically, more holistic and subjective admission criteria would be much more likely to benefit children of the city's professional elite than African American and Latino applicants, while penalizing lower middle class Asian American kids. Okay. What do you think about this example? Should Stuyvesant be abolished? Raise your hands if you think Stuyvesant should be abolished. Raise your hands if you do not think Stuyvesant should be abolished. Raise your hands if you're struggling. Okay? So yes. Okay, so first of all, one of the things I want to stop you guys from thinking is to stop thinking that things are simple. They're not simple. These things are hard. They're always hard. The data is hard, the science is hard, the policy is hard, the ethics are hard. It's hard to know. And we should allow ourselves, maybe, to make a different decision in the Swedish lunch lady than Stuyvesant. Or maybe not. Maybe we have consistent principles, and we apply them uniformly. Then maybe we fight it out. Maybe we discuss these issues and talk about them, and try to figure out what is the rational, fairest thing to do. And the really hard times come when reason and fairness, in some sense, might disagree. Where, for example, from a utilitarian point of view, you might say, oh, we want Stuyvesant to continue doing what he's doing, but then we have other conflicting ideals that conflict with that. If there wasn't a conflict, these wouldn't be hard decisions. Okay, so the lunch lady example, we say, oh, well, just who cares? It's just lunch. But maybe here we do care. So now we have values in conflict. Anyway, I'm glad to see that you guys were consistent. No to eliminating Stuyvesant, at least the majority of you, and no to eliminating the lunch lady. Any questions so far before I continue? Caleb.
Seems like you could have a very unequal society.
Yes.
On an absolute scale that's very high in material well-being, versus you could have you could have a very, very poor society that's relatively equal. And we would probably say the former is better.
Yes, well, it depends on whether we would say that. That's the conflict. In fact, then it becomes politicized as well. Because typically, and I think I alluded to this the other day, the right will say this inequality is the price we pay for greater wealth. And and everyone is richer, and so what do we care if there's more inequality? And the left will say, no, we care about inequality, we don't care if everyone's richer. This is playing out right now in the presidential candidates, different people taking different positions.